across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. From healthcare workers to those overseeing essential services, to those of us hunkering down at home. At Polar Bears International, we are inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another.
And we're committed to doing our part to support you.
So we'll be coming to you live from our homes around the globe, offering a special Spring Tender Connections series. Live broadcasts dedicated to learners of all ages, but especially to students who are learning at home.
Oh, hi! If you're a kid like me, go to Tundra Connections to learn all about polar bears and their favorite food, seals!
Join us each week this spring for something unique. Add Tundra Connections into the mix for your learning during COVID routine. Tune into a lighthearted live chat or enjoy a live stream over breakfast with 2 adorable polar bear cubs in the Netherlands.
Participate in conversations with scientists and take a deep dive into the world of polar bear research and policy. Ask your questions directly and learn from the experts.
Although we are physically distant, we can continue to find ways to be socially connected and come together with our friends, families, and communities.
We hope you'll join us to follow your curiosity and to find a little Arctic inspiration through virtual windows into the polar bear's world.
Hello and welcome to Polar Bears International Spring Tender Connections series. My name is BJ Kirschhoffer and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. I'm joined today with a very special guest, Jan Aars. Jan, you are with the Norwegian Polar Institute and you're in Tromsø, Norway, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you today. I just want to say quick thanks to explore.org for providing this stream for us today, this platform for us to work off of. We are going to do a little broadcast today talking about polar bears and the differences between the different populations. The title of today's webcast is Do Polar Bears in Norway Have a Different Accent? Of course, the content's catered to kids, but anybody is welcome to join. If you have a question during today's broadcast, please throw it in the chat window down below or email us at questions@pbears.org and we'll see if we can't stump Jan with your polar bear questions. So with that, maybe we'll just dive right in. Do polar bears have a different accent in Norway? Of course, polar bears don't speak, so they don't have a different accent, but there are differences between these bears. Jan, maybe you could answer the first question here. Are there subspecies? Are there kind of physical differences between these bears, or are polar bears just one species of animal?
It's absolutely only one species. The only thing you could argue is, I guess, if polar bear is an own species or if it's the same species as brown bears. I think almost all of us agree it's actually an own species, but some people, use a definition that if they can get juveniles that again can get juveniles mating, then it's not different species. And actually, polar bears are so closely related to brown bears that they can have fertile juveniles with brown bears, which also happens. So if anything, it's a subspecies, but it's most right to say that polar bears is one big species of polar bears. And we also used to actually argue that it's not several populations, but it's only one single huge population of polar bears because they are very similar all over the place.
Wow, so we've actually done a couple webcasts about the hybrid bears. I'm glad you brought that up. So some people maybe call them grizzly bears or growler bears. It's pretty rare to have them in the wild. Is that right?
To have, yeah, in the wild, yeah, it's pretty rare, but I think it's two things. That is the reason why there have been more cases like the last 10 years or something, several cases where it's proved that you have hybrids. And one is that you have the genetic method. So when you find a bear that looks a bit strange, now you can just do genetics and you find, oh, the father was a grizzly or something like that. Earlier, maybe you just thought, okay, it was a bit unusual. And the other thing is that it is likely that it is something that happens more frequently now than before, just because you have more areas where brown bears didn't occur earlier and when they actually meet polar bears.
That is fascinating. So would you refer to them as grizzly bears or growler bears? What's your preferred English term for the hybrid?
I'm not so into it, but I guess it's different. They use different terms depending on which species is the mother and which species is the father. Isn't that so?
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
So maybe this would be a good time to talk about just where polar bears are. Of course, if you look at the globe from the top down, that's where polar bears are. But what nations maybe do polar bears live in? Can you name those for us, Johan?
Yeah, I think I should remember. It's Norway, for sure. I know because I captured polar bears there. And then it's Greenland, which is politically also together with Denmark. And then it is Canada, of course, where most of the polar bears are. And then it's United States with Alaska. And then it's Russia.
Okay, so that's the 5 of them, and these places, they're hard to get to. Not many people get to visit these places, so maybe folks don't really know what they look like. Are all the polar nations? Are all these places that polar bears live exactly the same? Do they look the same, or are these places quite different depending on where you are in the Arctic?
From what I've heard, it can be very different. I haven't been all over Arctic. I've been visiting you in Canada. I've been in Svalbard. I've been visiting a colleague in Greenland, so I've seen some of it. But there is a lot of places where you have polar bears that I've only heard about and I've never seen. So the picture you have here looks very much like Svalbard, with a lot of mountains, steep terrain. Not very big. Svalbard, it's only a few hundred kilometers, from east to west, north to south on some of the biggest islands. And then you have vast, huge areas, of course, in Alaska and Canada, and some of those areas can be pretty flat. Also, much of Russia is very, very flat. So they don't look the same. Not for the bears neither.
But the place where polar bears actually prefer to be isn't really on the land, where you might have mountains or you might have very flat tundra. It's really on the sea ice that they want to be. Is that right?
Yeah. So most of us would say that polar bears are a marine mammal. And that is because they depend on the ocean and the sea ice. They don't depend so much on land. You can have polar bears that stay for 1, 2, 3 years on sea ice and don't walk on land at all. Other places, maybe they are on land a lot of the time, but they couldn't survive without the sea ice. But some of them might survive without land. So they're depending on the sea ice because what they eat is on the sea ice. Some places, like in Svalbard, the main reason why they have to be on land from time to time is actually that they can't make the den in the sea ice because it's like too unstable. So every time they want to go on land and have cubs, they need to reach islands.
Otherwise, if they had their choice and if there was enough sea ice, they would maybe spend their entire life on the frozen ocean. Is that right?
Yeah, so in some places where you have what you call multi-year ice that is several years old and very much more stable than what we mostly have in Svalbard, then they can make dens in the ice and stay there for the whole winter without any danger, you know, that the things melts underneath them and the cubs goes into the sea. And then they actually don't depend on being on land, but in Svalbard they do. Every time they want to have cubs, they need to go on land.
So I think it'd be good to circle back around here real quick. So they're on the sea ice because that's where the food that they want to eat exists. They don't eat land-based foods. They don't eat things that are walking on the land. They eat seals that swim in the ocean. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, polar bears, they are not picky. So they eat whatever they get, but the best food they have is seals, and particularly the blubber on the seal, which has a lot of energy. So if they are on land and there is some food there, you know, they find some birds or eggs, they can take it. But there is one, I find the very best argument when people say, well, they can just be on land and survive and eat other things. The best argument against that is that you don't find polar bears anywhere in the Arctic where you don't have sea ice, at least part of the year. If they didn't depend on sea ice, you would, I think, find polar bears other places where it wasn't sea ice. So the thing is that most of the energy they gain, on which they depend to be able to reproduce and survive, is on the ocean. And they don't necessarily need to be on the sea ice a lot of the time, because they have an incredible ability to gain a lot of fat reserves over a short period when they can take a lot of seals. So it's most important that they have sea ice in early spring and summer, when they can take small seal pups, and later when they can take adult seals that are on the ice shedding their fur.
Sometimes I like to think of polar bears almost like a battery. They when they go out and eat the seals, they're almost recharging their batteries. But they're like a really big battery, because they can go for quite a long time without eating, kind of running off their fat reserves.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And so I think maybe this is a good place to talk about one of the big differences. Maybe is you could have polar bears in Canada that females that may have to come off the ice and go to land sometime in the summer, and then they'll have to go into the den to go give birth. They could spend up to 8 months off the ice and not eating, that's a huge amount of time to go.
Yeah, it's incredible. And not only being without food, but also having to invest in 1 or 2 cubs that grow from maybe a bit more than half a kilo when they get born, about midwinter or a bit early maybe in Canada, and until they go out of the den maybe 4 months later or 5 months later or whatever. And then cubs grow from that small size up to 10 kilos or something each. And that's a lot of fatty milk and a lot of kilos of fat reserves for the mother. And at the same time, she has to stay alive herself.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, I get kind of cranky if I miss one meal, you know, much less 8 months of meals.
Yeah, I also would have problem with that many months.
Yeah. So I think as on the topic of denning there, in Canada, polar bears, well, at least in the Hudson Bay, in the very southern part of Canada, polar bears den very differently than they might in Norway. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is interesting because we say that polar bears are so much alike all over the place, particularly genetically, but they do adapt, you know, and they do use the resources they have. So in Svalbard, they always den on land, and what they do is maybe in late October, early November or something, they look after a snowdrift, a place with enough snow that they can make a den. And snow insulates very, very well against the cold. So that's a good place to make a den. And they dig this den. They don't use much time, a few hours, I think, and they have a den. And they use that den for months. In Hudson Bay, what they would do is, you know, to go inland, and they find all dens in the turf that could be very, very old, and dig or use those dens, and then the den sort of extend from that when it starts snowing. So they have a den that is partly in the turf, partly out in the snow. And then outside Alaska, many bears can go and make dens, as we said, in the multi-year ice. So that's like the three main different type of dens you'll have. I was also told from Christine, our friend that do work in East Greenland, that she found dens on the sea ice, and not like on big pieces of ice like outside Alaska, but on the fast ice that was connected to land, because that was probably very, very, very stable compared to what we have in Svalbard. So then they made dens out on there if they just had some structures that they had some drifts of snow on that ice.
Oh, wow. So they're really implementing many different strategies in order to reproduce and bring these cubs into the world.
Yeah. And also the length of the periods they are in then also vary a lot from Hudson Bay, where it could be like 7-8 months, to Svalbard, where I would say up to 5.
Okay,
Still
that's a huge
period.
difference.
Still a long
Yeah,
period.
still a long time, but kind of a great difference in the amount of time when you think about it.
Yeah.
I think another neat difference maybe is these, we're going to use a bigger word here, pelagic bears versus resident bears. So pelagic meaning bears that live out on the ice solely, or almost as much as they can, versus bears that might be have a very small home range. Like polar bears can cover a lot of ground in 1 year if they have to.
Yeah, that's right, and this varies, both with the area. What is the common strategy? But in Svalbard, where we work, we have a few hundred, like maybe up to 300 bears that are what we call local bears, and they never leave Svalbard. They just stay there year round. And of course, when you get longer and longer periods with out sea ice, they also necessarily stay much more on land than they would do if it was sea ice, and they could use more time on the ice hunting. But they would still always use sea ice part of the year. And then we also have those pelagic bears there, and they can walk hundreds of kilometers over to Western Russian Arctic. And there is a group of islands there too that they could then either in Svalbard or in Franz Josef land. And they also walk up to the ice edge and hunt there for much of the year, and then they get back to Svalbard or to the islands of Franz Josef land when they need to go into den, for example. Or when the ice edge is close to Svalbard, you could always meet those bears. But when the ice edge is much further north, you don't see them so often. So they used to be more common in Svalbard 20 years ago when we had more sea ice. Now often the sea ice is further north, so you don't see that many of those bears as we used to. If you're a researcher like me, being out in Svalbard and you capture a bear, you wouldn't know if it's like a pelagic bear or a local bear. You can catch them exactly the same place, at least part of Svalbard. You wouldn't have a clue. And then you put on a collar, and then you see, and maybe the bear just goes over to Russia, or maybe it stays.
Oh, that's interesting. So before satellite collars, maybe we wouldn't have known this, that some bears just stay very local and some bears take these long annual walks.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was, when you had a lot of trappers in Svalbard that shot or captured bears and sold the hides, they had theories. And some of them said that it was 2 types of bears. And they even said they look different. I've seen a few hundreds and I can't see the difference, but some of them said they were. One were more like squared in what it looked like, and the other one was longer and leaner or something like that. But they did say that it was 2 types of bears. Some of them followed the ice and some were local. So probably they had some ideas. One thing I think is that many of the local bears actually disappeared in that period where it was very high hunting pressure. that it was like an old strategy that many stayed in Svalbard. But if you're very local and you stay in a place where it's people regularly, you wouldn't have a high chance to survive for many years. Because back then, you know, if you go 50, 100 years back in time, people would shoot almost every bear they saw. So I think they were shot in many areas, and I think that some of those bears we have that are local now in some part of Svalbard, they have actually only been there for a shorter period. Maybe something that was a pelagic bears earlier just randomly came there and saw, okay, maybe I want to stay here, or maybe it was local in another area in Svalbard where it was less hunting pressure, and one year she drifted around Spitsbergen with the sea ice and came to land somewhere and saw, okay, it's no other bears here, I'll rather stay here. So it was places in Svalbard where it was very few bears 30, 40 years ago, where we now have a few local bears. And I don't think they've been there for that long.
Yeah, and we should say that the hunting in Svalbard stopped in 1973, is that right?
That is right. And I would say maybe from 1830 or something, it was quite a lot of hunting on polar bears. From 1870, it was very intense. It was taken on average a bit more than 300 bears per year for 100 years. So altogether like 30,000 bears that was taken, not only Svalbard, but in the Norwegian Arctic. So also up in the ice from sealers and so on, but a lot of them from Svalbard. Many from Svalbard, from overwinters and people catching seals and so on. Before that, it was actually more money catching walrus, whales, some of the seals and so on. But when they ran empty of some of those creatures, they started hunting polar bears more intensely.
So we've got some really good questions coming in, Johan. The first one here is, does the fur differ from polar bears from different places? So would the fur be different maybe in a Canadian bear versus a Norwegian bear?
My guess is that it's very similar. So what I do know about fur is that polar bear fur has like two different sort of layers. You have what you call the woolly fur that is like very, very fluffy inside, and then you have the long guard hairs outside. The guard hairs is good to repel water and so on, and the like dense under fur is keeping them very warm. What could vary a bit, I guess, is that they get thinner fur in the summer. They shed the fur sometime, maybe from May to August or something like that. And then after that, the fur grows out and to a certain length, and then they keep that fur for maybe 8, 9, 10 months or something like that before they shed it again. And it could be, of course, that in areas where you have longer summers, where it's warmer, they have a longer period before they shed the fur and they start growing or something like that again. Just like you can have variation for dogs depending on whether or not it's cold or warm and so on. But that the main type of fur is the same.
It's the same. So if you were to take a Canadian bear and stand it next to a Norwegian bear, they would look pretty much the same.
They would look very much the same. I think many of us would have a hard time to look at it and say this must be a Canadian bear.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question. You know, where were some of the largest polar bears ever captured? Were they in one part of the Arctic versus another, or could you just have kind of big bears wherever?
That's a good question. It does vary, and I think as with a lot of mammals, it would vary. You know, where you get the biggest individuals, and as with a lot of other things, things are bigger in the States, you know, than in Europe, and so there would be bigger bears that have been shot in Canada and Alaska than in Svalbard. Also in the very eastern part of Russia, I think they grow pretty big. But one thing that has happened is that, and some people claim that is because of climate change, that it's not so easy for bears to get food anymore, is that in places in Canada, for example, where you used to have a lot of very big bears, they don't grow that big anymore as they used to. So we're sort of catching up in Svalbard. We're getting closer. And maybe in 10 years, maybe we just laugh of the small Canadian bears. Who knows?
Who knows? It's hard to say. But what's interesting, I think, about that is the only reason we know that bears are getting smaller is that people like yourself have been studying bears for a long time and making the same measurements over that same period of time, right?
That is true. And not only are we making measurements, but we do both capture and what you call a recapture. And we also age the bears. So, you know, those bears, they have those huge carnivore teeth that they can use for killing prey and so on. But they also have some tiny teeth just behind each of the each big tooth. They have one tiny one, which I think is designed mostly for the scientists. So we can take that tiny tooth, so it's like 5 millimeter long or something, slide it just like, and look at the growth layers just like you look at a tree. And the reason why that works is that they eat a lot in spring and much less the rest of the year. Then you get narrow and wide layers for every year. And then you can see, okay, this bear was probably 7 years old. So that way, not only do you get the size of the bear, but you got the size of the bear when it's like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years. So it's not so fair to say, okay, they're bigger in that area, because maybe it's just because you get older bears, because maybe in another area they were all shot before they got old or something like that. But now we also know how big they are when they are different ages. And we also know that females, they don't grow much after they're like maybe 7, 8 years old. They don't grow much at all, maybe 1 or 2 centimeters the rest of their life. And males don't grow much after they are like 9, 10 years. They also almost stop growing. So that's how old they are when they are sort of grown out. And most of the growth is until they're like 5 years old.
Okay. And they get really big really fast over those 5 years. They go from 1 pound when they're born to how big?
Yeah. So a female maybe 220 centimeter, and I have no idea how many inches that would be. And then the males maybe 2 meter and 40, 2 meter and so or even a bit longer than that sometimes.
Yeah.
From the tip of the
animal.
nose to the end of the tail. Yeah, they're big. And when they stand on 2 legs, you know, they get even bigger, because the length is from the tail to the nose, and then without the back hind legs.
Right.
So if they stand straight up on 2 legs, they're huge.
Yeah, they're super big. So Emanuela is asking, do polar bears have territories? Are they territorial?
They're not very territorial, we used to say. It's interesting. I actually have a student that do a thesis, a master thesis just now, that looks at home ranges. And what you see on some of those bears is they use exactly the same area year after year. So then you could, maybe some people would say, okay, they have territories. But what you used to say when you say that some animals are territorial is that they actually defend an area. So they say, okay, this is mine. You're not allowed to be inside here. So it's not enough that you are in the same area. Territory also means that you defend it. And polar bears actually don't seem to do that. And brown bears do. They defend territories very fiercely. So female would defend the territory because it's good resources there, maybe a lot of blueberries to eat and so on. And males would defend an area because he defends an area where you have females. But polar bears, the area is unpredictable. So it could be a different place where you have sea ice and seals 1 year compared to another year. So then they think, okay, I don't care. I won't use a lot of energy to say, okay, this is my place. So thus you can often see several bears in the same area, and they don't care so much. They defend their prey. So if you kill a seal, they defend it for against another bear, but it's not like you fight for not allowing other bears into your area.
So
that's
Jan,
one of the differences. One of the main differences between brown bears and polar bears ecologically.
I've heard stories of places where brown bears and polar bears overlap, and if there's a food source there, a brown bear could scare off several polar bears
That's what
just
I heard as
because maybe
well.
they're more, yeah, maybe more aggressive or whatever.
Yeah, so maybe because they are territorial, they're used to fight. Yeah. So polar bears, they males fight with females, but yeah.
How did you become a polar bear scientist? Did you always want to study polar bears?
No, I didn't. I was never thinking, that's what I want to do. What did I want to study? I wanted to study birds. That's what I wanted to study. Yeah. And then I found it was a master thesis I could take on birds, so that somebody asked for a student, and I was one day too late. So when I came to get it, they said, sorry, somebody took it yesterday. And then the guy that told me, he said, but if you want, you can study small rodents. So then I did. And then I worked with small rodents for 10 years. And then I didn't have any job anymore, so I started asking for other jobs. And then one of them was on polar bears. And so I applied and I got the job.
A lucky break.
Yeah.
Very cool.
But that's all.
Well, Jan,
is a lot of randomness. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very random, isn't it? And
yeah,
I think so. For any students that are watching, if polar bears or any other wildlife kind of piques your interest, I think one of the most important places you can start is just paying attention at school. Because all of these jobs require good math skills, good reading skills, good writing skills. And that's really a good foundation for any of these jobs. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that you are interested in what you do and put in high effort. And I mean, if you are, then somebody are going to pick you up and you get some interesting work. And I think that is the case almost independent on what sort of subject you do. I don't think it's so important if it's like biology or history or language or whatever. There is always need for bright people and particularly hardworking people. And another thing I would say is, if you want to be a biologist, what is important is that you work hard with some subject, and it's maybe not that important exactly what you work with, but if you want to study on bears, maybe you're lucky, or maybe you find you want to do something else.
I think those are good words of advice there, Jan. I think maybe one more question before we let you go for the day, and this is from Robert. And why don't the polar bears follow the receding ice northward? And I think what they're probably getting at is if there's less sea ice in the Arctic, why don't the polar bears just keep moving north with the sea ice?
In some way they do, So I think what's going to happen in for example, in Canada, is that the southern border where you have polar bears will move further and further north. And maybe you already see that in some parts. In Svalbard, it's a bit different, because Svalbard, Franz Josef Land, where we study bears, there are no islands north of Svalbard or north of Franz Josef Land. So if the sea ice get far north, they don't have those islands where they can go and of course, if all ice suddenly disappears around the North Pole, it's also a problem, because then they don't have any place for the north. But even if they had sea ice far north, it's also a case of productivity, that there are more resources where it's shallow water. So it's more seals where it's not so deep. And at the North Pole, it's like very, very deep water, and not many polar bears at all, because it's not many seals.
So polar bears are already living where they can live, and it's not like they can just go pick up and find some place that's better. They've found those places that are good.
But what is true is that there could be places in 40 years where you have polar bears, where you don't have so many today, because it's not so nice there today, but it's actually going to be a bit better. But it will be much fewer places if things goes as experts predict, if you lose even more sea ice. So it could be like high Arctic, Canada, Northwest Greenland. There could be patches where it's too much sea ice for polar bears today. Let's say you have 4-meter thick sea ice everywhere. How can you catch a seal? But in 40 years, maybe it's like sea ice more like in Svalbard. They don't like too much ice, you know. They like open lids with a bit of water so they can swim in between the ice floes and catch seals.
They're kind of picky.
Yeah, they're picky.
Yeah. Well, Jan, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for your thoughts and your time. We can let you go so you can get off to dinner. So thanks again for everybody else for tuning in today. Thanks to explore.org for lending us this software and this platform. Join us again here on Thursday. We'll have another chat at the same time, noon Central in the United States, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.